right, so we're going to go over some of the more basic elements that we're going to be using throughout. Right, the headings are the first one. Allows you to break up a document into multiple sections where you might have, big, bold headings that present a particular topic, and then several other headings that are somewhat smaller that allow you to break up large documents into smaller sections. Like HTML, we have we might introduce paragraphs if we're talking about HTML, introduce paragraphs, introduce headings, and then content that describes paragraphs and headings. There's also lists that allow you to elements that might be somewhat related to one another. You might want to list them. There's two versions of lists. You can have unordered lists and ordered lists, which either use bullets or numbers. There's several others that you can specify if you want Roman numerals and whatnot, or you can specify even if you want icons, right? If you want a be a little more fancy. But instead we'll use the CSS a little later on how to do that. There's also tables, and tables. The original intent of tables was to represent tabular data, right? Where you might have headings and where you describe the different fields that each record might have, where each row represents a different record that you might be displaying, and each row, right, has the same data types, for each one of the cells in that row. Tables are declared using the table, open table, closed table, and then you have a head, a body, and also a footer. Most people don't use a footer, but these are the more common ones. In the head, you can specify what are the titles or the headings of each one of the columns. So here we have username, password, first name, last name. This is actually relevant to part of your assignment that asks you to create a user admin. So this might be a good place to start. Notice in the table, in the head, we can declare any number of rows. Most people just use one row in the table heading, but you can actually have many. A table heading can have actually many rows. And inside of that row, you have many columns. In each column, we use a th for declaring each one of these headings. Also, by default, this border is not there. And you would just see one long list of headings. I added border equal 1 to add this border all around. The border here is referred to as an attribute. So an element or a tag, right, can have many number of attributes that allow you to configure that particular element. Here we're configuring the border equals quotations 1. The quotations can be either single quotes or double quotes, as long as you're consistent. And you can embed them. You can embed single quotes inside of double quotes or double quotes inside of single quotes, as long as you're consistent. And we'll come back to attributes a little later. Here in the body of the HTML table, here we have presumably all sorts of users, one user per row. Again, presumably these are all the same data types, right? So this column is only passwords. This column is only usernames, and so on and so forth, right? First names, last names, records, right? The way you might expect records to be. One thing that we'll come back to a little later is that in HTML, there is no native way of representing or laying out documents or pages that might have multiple, if you read a newspaper or magazine, it's very common that they will lay out the content in multiple columns. Yes, obviously in newspapers, right? When it's so long to read, it's very hard for somebody to just follow an entire line all the way down to the end of the page. Yes, so to make it easier on the eye, they break it up into smaller columns. Yes, so early on, when HTML just came out, there is no native way of laying out content in columns. So folks started using tables for that. Right? It says, ooh, I'll just use the columns and tables to generate these kinds of articles. Right? That's a no-no. Right? So that was very common. Early on, that's considered to be a bad practice. Instead, we'll be using CSS, right, to lay out the content in vertical, side-by-side content. Okay, so do not use HTML tables for laying out vertical content. We'll show you how to do that a little later with CSS. Input dates and dropdowns. So most of what we've seen so far is content that is read only, but we also want to use HTML to create interaction. Right? See that users can also provide data for us. For that, HTML declares quite a few fields, types of elements that we can type text or select radio buttons, checkboxes, text areas, drop downs, and whatnot. And so here's a couple of the simple ones. We have an input field over here, and we have two input fields. And just a couple of things here. So this input field is being rendered as this rectangular box where we can type text. It's notice the type says equal text. That is the default. So if you leave out this attribute, it would render as a text. Right? That's the default. But you can put here email, phone. You can put date. There's all sorts of types, and different types invoke certain behavior from the browser and some validation as well. Right? Text is unfeathered text and not validated. Just any text you can type in there. Presumably just a single line of text. Right? Notice that we gave it a title. Title allows you to kind of give it a kind of like a tooltip, right? If you hover over the elements, right, it would show whatever title you put here. Okay. Also, there's a placeholder. This placeholder configures this grayed out area. See that? It kind of gives us a hint at what we're expecting you to type. So if this were a telephone, maybe we would put there the format in what we want the telephone, right? Parentheses, dashes, and whatnot. Yes. So a placeholder is grayed out. When we start typing, the grayed out disappears and goes away. What else here? Notice that there's a label here. Notice that there's a username, Alice, first name, Alice, last name, and so on and so forth. That we're achieving. It could have been just plain old text, right? Because it looks like just plain old text. Yes, but here we decided to instead use this element called label. Okay, other than making it maybe a little bit bolder, other than that, it doesn't bias as much. Okay. Other than that, this 4 over here. See this 4 over here? So this 4 is. Notice that it has the same value as this ID over here. See that? Right. This ID, first of all, uniquely identifies this element in the page. Okay. It says that this element has this unique identifier, and it can be referenced from other places. Right. For instance, it's being referenced by this label. See that? Right. So the only thing that buys us is that if we click on the input, obviously it'll get focus, right? And we can start typing. But because now we have this label, we can now also click on that label, and the related field will also get a focus, right? Not much, but it buys us a little bit. It's more relevant when you are creating pages that are consumed in a phone, right? Where it's already a tiny little area, right? And folks are pecking at the screen trying to get the cursor in the right place. The bigger the area that you can give them for them to touch on, the better the experience for them will be. Yes. So it's considered best practice. It's a best practice to increase the touchable area. Okay. And to make any other text that is related to the clickable area also touchable. Okay. This will become more relevant when you have like radio buttons or checkboxes that are really, really small to peck at, right? And to put a text right next to it, right? That is for that checkbox. Yes. So that's a best practice. We're going to be looking for that, right? So make sure that you always have a label that it's referencing the input fields. Other couple things here. Notice that these are all nice and flush. Right now, that's the default. But we're going to be looking for that as well. Also, a good practice is that if indeed you're asking for generic text, then yes, use text. Right? But if you're looking for asking for something more specific, like a date or an email or a phone number or something specific, right? Then you should use the right data type over here. Okay, like for instance, if you're looking for a date, right? Don't use text. right? Because then you make it hard, you make it easier for folks to make a mistake, right? To forget the slash, the dash, or use the wrong year and whatnot. Be as strongly typed as you can, right? Be strongly typed. In here, notice that we're using type equal date, okay? And what that does is that when you click on the element, the browser will pop up the correct control, right, and allow you to select the date for you. Allows you to navigate and whatnot. The only caveat here, is that different browsers use different controls. The controls look a little bit different on Chrome than it looks on Firefox, on Safari, and so that kind of breaks the look and feel, right? That you have. The one of the things that you do get from using this is that on the phone, right? When you're going to be typing something on a date, you'll get the right picker, right? The right control. On iOS or Android, you'll get the right control that pops up for your particular infrastructure, which is great. Yes.
Can you customize how the controls look?
No, they're not customizable. So a lot of people, what they do is that they use their own widgets, like a jQuery widget, or as we'll see later on, a Bootstrap widget, or or an Android material design widget, depending on which one they're targeting. Yeah. But nevertheless, at a minimum, if you're not going that far, it should have the right data type. Okay. Also notice the standard, the date standard that the elements have. And notice that there's a value attribute. The value attribute sets up the default value, right, for an element. Right. So for instance, if you want first name or last name or whatever to have a default value, right, you can use the value attribute and then whatever text you want. But this is also based on the what data type it is. Is it a text? Is it date? Is it an email? Right, it has to have the right value. So the data type, the format, the standard format is 4-digit year dash 2-digit month dash 2-digit day. There's also a couple things that we're not going to look at, but they're also interesting. You could put min and max. Okay, so for instance, you can block out dates before a date, right, or dates after a date. It says no, the only valid ones is this week, or this month, right, or this year, and just block out everything else. So there's min, max that can also set you up also for numbers, and so on and so forth. Drop downs with select. You can have options. So select is the wrapper, and then the option is each one of these elements that you can select from. So what is displayed here, right, is the content of the option. See that? But if you do select a particular element, the actual value of what you selected is whatever value you gave that option. See that? Right. Now the content here in the option is usually for human consumption, right? For visually pleasing, or maybe explaining, or what this option is, right? You might give it student dash only have read-only access or something. Yes, something that might be useful for humans. Yes, but the actual value, usually this value for you might be some token, right, or something that the server might be useful, that it can parse, right? Maybe it's mapped to some key in some database that you can then use it programmatically. Usually it'll be some all uppercase with some constants, right, that you're going to send over to the server, right? So make sure to use both. You can also select the original one, the one that is by default selected by using a checked, right, or selected attribute. A selected attribute will by default select the actual value. Buttons and radius and checkboxes. There's buttons that allow you to invoke or start a behavior. By default, the interpretation of these buttons was, the default interpretation was that you put all these elements inside of a form, right? And this form you fill out, and the form elements typically would have had a URL where to send all this data when you fill it out, right? So that the server can process it. Yes, that's the default behavior, and it would be sent over to the server when you would click on a button of type submit. Okay, that's the default behavior. We're not going to use that behavior, right? If you remember, we're using the single page application architecture where we come to a page and we never leave that page, right? So submitting a form would leave the page. Yes, right? So we don't want to leave the page. We want to stay always on the page. So what we're going to do is that we're going to abandon submit. Right? Submit would actually submit and leave the page. Instead, if you're using a button, we'll use type button or something else which does not submit the form. Instead, we're going to whenever you want to submit a form, we notify some JavaScript. The JavaScript will parse the content, validate, run some error checking, right? And once it's happy that actually the data is all nice and good, then it will programmatically send it over to a server. Yes, using Ajax, right? And we'll talk about Ajax a little later. It will do an HTTP post or an HTTP get, but programmatically as opposed to the browser submitting for you. So here's more examples of using other elements like checkboxes and radio buttons. Notice that these are embedded inside of the label. See that? They're not using the for, right? They're not using the for. Instead, we're embedding the entire input field inside of the label, meaning that the radio button itself plus any text that we have there is clickable, right? The whole thing is clickable, and this helps you, again, to make it easier for folks that are using small screens or tablets, right, to much more easily click on the element. So it improves the experience. So yes, make sure that you use these best practices. Anchors allow you to declare certain pieces of text so that you can navigate to other pages. So for instance, this all lectures are available at this Janunzi at YouTube. So if you click on that, you would go to my channel. But again, we're going to abandon this, right? This is the default behavior of anchors, is to drop the current HTML documents and replace that document with some other document. Yes, right? We're going to abandon that default behavior. Right? Instead, all interactions with anchors, buttons, and whatnot are always going to be first intercepted by JavaScript. JavaScript will decide what to do on what you should see next. Okay? And if we have to navigate to some other content, well, we'll go fetch that using Ajax, and we'll replace the DOM with whatever content you need to see. Okay? But we'll never actually navigate anywhere. Well, only the first assignment. Right? This first assignment you will. And the first assignment, when you click on login, register, right, you navigate to the profile page, right? Or you can navigate between the login and the registration page. Right? So that behavior is the default behavior. Okay, we'll be abandoning that when we start using jQuery, React, Angular, Vue, and whatnot.
Hi everyone, Jose here. Please remember to subscribe and like the video. And if you have any questions, please leave a comment down below. Thank you.